The world has crossed a number so large it barely feels real. Military spending is no longer counted in the hundreds of billions, but in the trillions, in Europe alone. Defense budgets are rising at a speed not seen since the Cold War. Tanks, drones, artillery shells. Missile systems orders are signed almost weekly, figures announced with solemn faces and urgent language. And yet, on the streets below those announcements, something feels deeply contradictory. Hospitals remain understaffed. Rent continues to rise faster than wages. Young families postpone having children. Public transport systems age quietly, so the question forms almost on its own. If governments can suddenly find tens of billions for weapons, why does everything else still feel starved of money? Where does this funding really come from? And more importantly, who ends up paying the bill? This is the story of Europe's quiet transformation into a new kind of wartime economy, not one defined by ration cards and arid silence, but by budget constraints, political trade-offs, and a slow, grinding pressure on everyday life. It is a story about security and fear, but also about incentives, power, and choices. And it is a story whose consequences will be felt long after the headlines about tanks and missiles fade. To understand how Europe arrived here, it helps to step back to the decades that came before. After the end of the Cold War, much of Europe entered what policymakers proudly called the peace dividend. Defense budgets were cut. Bases were closed. Conscription was suspended in many countries. Money once reserved for tanks and troops was redirected towards social programs, infrastructure, and the expansion of the welfare state. Germany became the symbol of this shift. Its military shrank dramatically, while public investment flowed into pensions, health care, and reunification with the former East. Across the continent, similar patterns emerged. Europe built an identity around stability, trade, and soft power. War, many believed, had become something that happened elsewhere. This worldview shaped budgets for more than 30 years. Defense spending hovered well below Cold War levels. Military industries consolidated or pivoted toward civilian markets. Supply chains thinned. Ammunition stockpiles were treated as legacy artifacts rather than strategic necessities. Then, in 2022, that assumption shattered. Russia's invasion of Ukraine did not just redraw borders on a map. It exposed how fragile Europe's security architecture had become. Within weeks, governments announced emergency increases in defense spending. Germany declared a historic Zeitenwende, a turning point, committing an extra 100 billion euros to its military almost overnight. Poland accelerated purchases of tanks and artillery. The Baltic states pushed defense budgets toward levels once considered unthinkable in peacetime. Suddenly, a new benchmark dominated political conversations: defense spending as a percentage of GDP. 2%, once treated as an aspirational NATO guideline, became a moral and strategic litmus test. Countries below it faced pressure from allies, voters, and media. Countries above it were praised as serious and responsible. But GDP percentages hide a crucial reality. They do not create money. They only define how it is allocated. A national budget is not a magical pool that expands at will. It is constrained by tax revenues, borrowing capacity, interest rates, and demographic realities. When one category grows rapidly, others must either grow more slowly, shrink, or be financed through debt. And in Europe today, debt is no longer cheap. This is where the real tension begins. Europe is aging, fewer workers support more retirees every year. Pension systems are under strain. Healthcare costs rise as populations live longer with chronic conditions. At the same time, Climate commitments demand massive investment in energy systems, transport, and housing retrofits. Into this already crowded fiscal landscape enters defense, demanding not marginal increases, but sustained, structural growth. The result is a silent competition inside national budgets, not a debate fought openly on talk shows, but a series of administrative decisions, delayed projects, frozen hiring plans, and quietly reduced ambitions. When finance ministers say defense spending will rise without cuts. Elsewhere, they usually mean something very specific. The cuts will be indirect, gradual, and politically invisible. Consider healthcare. Budgets may rise in nominal terms, but not fast enough to match inflation or demand. Hospitals feel the pressure not through headlines, but through longer waiting lists, burnout among staff, and postponed upgrades. Education experiences something similar. Class sizes creep upward. Maintenance is deferred. Teacher recruitment becomes harder. Housing is perhaps the most telling example. Europe faces a housing shortage driven by urbanization, migration, and years of underbuilding. Solving it requires long-term public investment, planning reform, and political patience. Defense spending, by contrast, offers immediate visibility. A tank delivery can be photographed. A missile contract can be announced. A housing reform takes a decade to show results. Political incentives matter. Defense spending can be framed as national survival. Housing spending is framed as policy debate. One creates unity through fear. The other invites disagreement. This dynamic explains why military budgets often expand faster than social ones, even when both are described as priorities. It is not that policymakers secretly dislike welfare states. It is that the political cost-benefit calculation favors defense in moments of perceived threat. Yet money alone does not buy readiness. Europe quickly discovered another problem: industrial capacity. For decades, European defense industries optimized for efficiency, not surge production. Factories were designed to meet predictable, peacetime demand. Supply chains were lean. Skilled labor was limited. When Ukraine required millions of artillery shells per year, Europe struggled to deliver them. Here lies a second paradox. Governments are willing to spend, but industry cannot instantly respond. Building a new ammunition plant takes years. Training specialized workers takes time. Securing raw materials involves global supply chains that are themselves under strain. So money flows first into long-term contracts, not immediate output. This creates a lag between budget announcements and battlefield impact. It also concentrates benefits in specific regions and sectors. Defense contractors see surging order books, share prices rise. Workers in these industries enjoy job security and wage growth. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the economy, the picture is less bright. Public sector wages struggle to keep pace with inflation. Service industries face labor shortages without the political leverage of defense. Inequality quietly widens not always between rich and poor individuals, but between sectors tied to national security and those deemed less strategic. This is how wartime economy takes shape without formal declaration, not through rationing, but through prioritization. The international comparison sharpens this picture. The United States also spends heavily on defense, but its economic structure is different. It has a massive domestic arms industry, a global reserve currency, and a federal budget that tolerates large deficits. When Washington increases military spending, it can borrow at scale, exporting some costs through dollar dominance. Europe cannot do this to the same extent. The euro is powerful, but fiscal policy remains largely national. Some countries, like Germany, retain more borrowing capacity. Others, particularly in southern Europe, face strict constraints from debt markets. This creates uneven pressure across the continent. Poland can justify high defense spending as existential. Italy must weigh every additional euro against debt sustainability. The Baltic states feel urgency. Spain feels distance. These differences strain political cohesion. Shared security goals collide. With an equal fiscal pain, citizens begin to ask why they are paying more taxes or receiving fewer services for threats that feel abstract or distant. At the human level, these questions become deeply personal. A nurse in a public hospital works double shifts because positions remain unfilled. A young couple in a major city spends over half their income on rent, delaying plans for children. A small town mayor postpones infrastructure repairs because funding has been redirected. None of these decisions are announced as consequences of defense spending. Yet they are part of the same budgetary reality. At the same time, a factory worker in a defense plant experiences the opposite trend. Overtime becomes plentiful. Training programs expand. The plant is declared strategically vital. Pride mixes with anxiety, pride in contributing to national security. Anxiety about what prolonged militarization means for the future. These parallel experiences coexist, rarely intersecting in public debate, historically. Europe has faced this trade-off before. During the Cold War, high defense spending limited welfare expansion in many countries. The difference today is demographic and economic context. Europe is older, slow-growing, and more indebted than it was in the 1960s or 1980s. Every euro carries more opportunity cost. The risk is not immediate collapse, but gradual erosion. Social trust weakens when citizens feel they are asked to sacrifice without seeing proportional benefit. Political polarization grows when trade-offs are denied rather than explained. Extremist narratives thrive in the gaps between official messaging and lived reality. This is why transparency matters. Pretending that rearmament is free undermines long-term support. Security built on denial is fragile. There are alternatives, but none are easy. Some economists argue for explicitly separating defense investment from day-to-day budgets through long-term European level financing. Others emphasize dual-use spending investments in infrastructure and technology that serve both civilian and military purposes, such as logistics, energy resilience, and cybersecurity. Reforming procurement could also reduce waste. Fragmented national systems inflate costs. Joint purchasing and standardization could stretch each euro further, but these reforms challenge national sovereignty and entrenched interests. On the revenue side, governments face uncomfortable options. Higher taxes, especially on wealth or windfall profits, could fund security without cutting services. Yet such measures provoke political backlash and capital flight fears. Borrowing more is possible, but only at high interest rates, shifting the burden to future generations. None of these paths avoid trade-offs. They only make them explicit. Looking forward, three broad scenarios emerge. In the optimistic scenario, Europe manages to align security and social investment. Defense spending stabilizes at a sustainable level. Industrial capacity expands efficiently. Social systems are protected through targeted taxation and growth-enhancing reforms. Citizens understand the costs and accept them as necessary. In the pessimistic scenario, rearmament continues unchecked while social systems quietly deteriorate. Inequality deepens. Public trust erodes. Defense becomes politically toxic, associated not with safety but with sacrifice imposed from above. The very cohesion that security policy aims to protect begins to fracture. The most likely outcome lies somewhere in between: a prolonged period of tension, incremental adjustment, and political contestation. No dramatic collapse, but no easy balance either. What matters most is not the size of the defense budget alone, but how honestly societies confront its implications. Security is not only about borders and deterrence. It is also about whether people feel protected in their daily lives by healthcare systems that function, housing they can afford, and institutions they trust. In that sense, Europe's rearmament is not just a military project. It is a social test. History suggests that societies can endure high defense spending for long periods, but only when the burden is perceived as fair and the purpose is clear. When costs are hidden and benefits uneven, resentment grows. When trade-offs are denied, democracy weakens. The bill for security has arrived. It is being paid quietly, line by line, across national budgets and household lives. The question now is not whether Europe can afford to defend itself. It is whether it can do so without hollowing out the very society it seeks to protect. Because in the end, the strongest defense is not just weapons and budgets, but a population that believes the system asking for a sacrifice is worth defending, and that belief, once lost, is far more expensive to rebuild than any tank or missile system ever could be.